Thank you. It was a delight listening to Dr. Aisha Siddiqa as always. And I agree with her overall assessment that Pakistan is in a very difficult situation, primarily because the way the elites have shaped Pakistan um, over the last 70 years, and you alluded to that as well, is that it's become an economy that is addicted to war dollars. So dollars associated with wars. In Pakistan, opposition movements are now calling them dollari jange. So wars fought for dollars. And this was part of a plan to make Pakistan um, have a very peculiar role in the region after the decolonization that happened that began in the 1940s. Now, I would like to say a little bit about the nature of the global order, and then I'd like to go back to Dr. Aisha and maybe she could tell us what are the options now and what's the way forward. You see, the questions of our times have changed, not just over the last 2 weeks, most dramatically over the last 2 weeks, but also over the past few years. In the 19th century, it was very clear that you have a colonial system and a colonial system that needed to reproduce itself and it needed loyal subjects. This was in India, Africa, other places. And the question for a lot of local populations was how do you um, close the gap in education, science, technology, and slowly get some kind of representation within the system. After the First World War, 1919, the question changed, and you had the eruption of anti-colonial movements, not just in India, with the Jallianwala Bagh massacre being a major event, but also in Egypt, in other parts of Africa, Arab world. So you had this wave of anti-colonial or decolonial nationalism that gripped the world. So the question was, how do you organize it and when? After 1947, the big question was how to create nation states that can reject these centuries of humiliation and exploitation and build states that are oriented towards the welfare of the people, but also can defend their people militarily from foreign powers. Now, this is also a period in which two big things are happening. One, the old colonial world is going away, Britain, France, Belgium. So European countries are fading, and you have the rise of the US, which is a different kind of an empire, which is not interested in direct colonialism in different parts of the world, but wants to maintain power through neocolonial means. And you have the rise of the Soviet Union, the socialist bloc, and third world nationalist movements. So this is a very serious challenge to the global imperial order in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s. And the strategy that the US deploys during this period is to create certain groups and institutions that can do America's bidding in their own countries. And through this process, it was actually the institution of the military on which Dr. Aisha Siddiqa has written fantastic books. It's the institution of the military that became the favorite institution for the Americans, not just in Pakistan, but also in Indonesia, in the Philippines, in Argentina, in Brazil. There's a whole like international architecture that was created by the US through a web of military pacts, Cito Cento being very important for us in Pakistan that we signed in the 1950s. And there were two aspects of this, basically, of the strategy. The main aspect, of course, the main purpose was to contain socialism and contain some kind of anti-colonial third world nationalism. And there was a military component to that by putting these countries in these military pacts, by training their officers in the US, the Indonesian officers, the Filipino officers, the Pakistani officers, officers from the Khaliji states, officers from across the third world were being trained in the US so that they can do America's bidding once they return. But also there was an economic dimension where in order to create this kind of imperial hegemony, they wanted these countries to remain economically dependent. And then you have the IMF, the World Bank, later WTO. But one thing that was important, even in that period, even through the economic exploitation, was to give some notion of development, because they also wanted to win over certain layers of the third world. Now, coming to the current period, I think that era is over. After the dissolution of the Soviet Union, two things are happening. One, America feels there's no big global threat, which is now changing with the emergence of China. But also another problem for the US is that the US is not an industrial powerhouse the way it used to be in the 1940s. Its industries have shifted to Asia, and you have this rise of this new giant, China. The new strategy for the US is not to try to win over countries through economic development. In fact, one report just shows that 41% of budgets across the third world are being spent on repaying loans. So we're not in an era of development. We are in an era of de-development. Countries are being de-developed. And those countries who still want to resist, they get sanctions. Cuba, Venezuela, there's a list of about 60, 70 countries in the world that are sanctioned. They are pushed to not only sanctions, but then you have proxy wars, and Middle East is one example of the proxy wars, or you have direct Western bombardment, which is what's happened in the case of Libya, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen. So the point of these IMF conditionalities, which push privatizations. If you don't do that, then sanctions. If that doesn't work, then proxy wars. If that doesn't work, then Western bombardment. The point of all of this is to destroy the state capacity of all these countries, the capacity of states. So what we are entering an era, or have entered an era of in which destruction is the primary mode of communication that empire has with the rest of the world. And it's a destruction without reconstruction, because after 45, the US reconstructed Europe through the Marshall Plan, reconstructed Japan, spent a lot of money in Taiwan and other places. Now it's pure destruction. Afghanistan is a lesson in that. Iraq is a lesson in that. So I'll just end my presentation here by saying that we have this dual task now. And this is something, and here I again would like to agree with Dr. Aisha Siddiqa. The Pakistani state is oriented towards getting these rents from the US to do its bidding in the region. It has not oriented itself for long-term development. It has not oriented itself towards industrialization. It has not oriented itself towards the development of its own people, not just productive resources. So with that kind of a big gap, this kind of a paranoid national security state is one, it loses legitimacy internally, and externally it can very quickly go back into the American ambit if America doesn't need to convince Pakistanis, it needs to convince a few people in Pindi. And unless we overcome this crisis of legitimacy and we reorient ourselves from being a decadent national security state, which is fighting for other countries and for other peoples who wants to be included in the stories of other countries rather than writing its own script, writing its own history, will remain powerless. So the only way we can use the opportunities that arise is by asserting a new will, and which is oriented towards long-term development of our people, of our country, which requires regional integration.